2019, a Harvard study found that lonely people's brains literally shrink faster than normal. But here's the shocking part. The loneliest people in the study weren't living alone. They were surrounded by family, friends, and co-workers every single day. If you've ever felt completely alone in a crowded room, or scrolled through social media at 2 a.m., feeling more disconnected than ever, your brain is actually rewiring itself for depression and anxiety. But what if I told you this same mechanism can be reversed to create unshakable inner peace? 2,500 years ago, a prince who had everything, unlimited wealth, a beautiful wife, constant entertainment, felt so profoundly lonely that he gave it all up to sit alone under a tree. That single decision created a practice that modern neuroscience now proves can literally rewire your brain for happiness in just 8 weeks. I'm about to share 6 ancient stories that reveal why some of the wisest people in history chose solitude over society. But more importantly, you're going to discover a secret that could transform your loneliest moments into your most powerful ones. By the end of this hour, you'll understand why that ache in your chest isn't a sign that something's wrong with you. It's actually your brain's way of calling you home to yourself. You'll learn practical techniques that Buddhist monks use to find more joy in silence than most people find in a lifetime of relationships. Whether you're lying awake, unable to sleep, dealing with a breakup, or just tired of feeling empty despite having everything you thought you wanted, the next 60 minutes could change how you experience being human. The first story alone will make you question everything you believe about what you need to be happy. And by the way, that prince who sat under the tree, his technique is still being taught in hospitals and universities worldwide because it works. Let's begin. Picture this. You wake up every morning in a palace where your biggest decision is which golden cup to drink from. Servants anticipate your every need before you even speak it. The finest musicians play your favorite songs. The most beautiful gardens stretch as far as you can see. You have literally everything a human being could want. But here's what no one tells you about having everything. It can feel like having nothing at all. This was the reality for a young man named Siddhartha, born into royalty over 2,500 years ago in what is now Nepal. His father, King Suddhodana, loved his son so much that he tried to create a perfect world for him. No sadness was allowed in the palace. No one was permitted to speak of death, illness, or aging. The king thought he was protecting his son, but he was actually creating a beautiful prison. Now here's what's fascinating about this story, and why it matters for anyone who's ever felt alone in a crowd. Siddhartha had every form of external connection you could imagine. People surrounded him constantly. He had a beautiful wife named Yasodhara, loving parents, endless entertainment. Yet something inside him felt deeply empty. Sound familiar? In our modern world, we call this surrounded but starving. You can be at a party with 50 people and feel like the loneliest person in the room. You can have hundreds of followers on social media, but no one to call when you're crying at 3 a.m. You can be in a relationship, even a good one, and still feel fundamentally misunderstood. This is what Buddhist psychology calls the suffering of having everything but feeling nothing. It's what happens when we try to fill our inner emptiness with external things. And here's the thing that will blow your mind. The more we try to fill that emptiness from the outside, the emptier we feel. Siddhartha lived this paradox every single day. He was surrounded by beauty, luxury, and constant attention, yet he felt like he was suffocating. Have you ever felt that way? Like you're performing a role, but your true self is locked away somewhere no one can reach. One day, Siddhartha did something that shocked everyone. He asked to leave the palace walls. For the first time in his 29 years of life, he wanted to see the real world. And what he discovered outside those protected walls changed everything. He saw an old man, bent with age, struggling to walk with a stick. "What's wrong with him?" Siddhartha asked his charioteer, Channa. "That's old age, my prince. It comes to everyone if they live long enough." The next day, he saw a sick man burning with fever, trembling and weak. "That's illness," Channa explained gently. "It visits all of us without invitation." Then came the sight that shattered his protected world completely. A funeral procession carrying a dead body. "What's happening to that person?" Siddhartha whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's death, my prince. It's what happens to every living being, including you and me. But here's the part that often gets overlooked in the telling of this story, and it's the most important part for us today. That same day, Siddhartha saw something else. A wandering monk walking alone, carrying nothing but a simple bowl, his face peaceful and serene despite having no palace, no servants, no protection from life's harsh realities. This image haunted Siddhartha. Here was someone who had nothing by worldly standards, yet seemed to possess everything that truly mattered. The monk was alone, but he wasn't lonely. He had discovered something that no amount of external comfort could provide. In Zen Buddhism, there's a teaching that says, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." What changes isn't what we do, but how we experience what we do. The monk had discovered this secret, how to be completely present and at peace, regardless of external circumstances. That night, while his newborn son slept and his wife rested peacefully, Siddhartha made a choice that would echo through history. He decided to leave everything behind, not out of rejection or anger, but out of love. Love for a truth he sensed was waiting in the silence beyond those palace walls. Now, you might be thinking, "That's a beautiful story, but I can't just abandon my life and become a monk." And you're absolutely right. But here's the deeper teaching that changes everything. Siddhartha's real journey wasn't geographical. It was psychological. The palace he left wasn't just a building. It was a state of mind that constantly needed external validation to feel okay. Every time we reach for our phone when we're feeling lonely, every time we turn on Netflix to fill the silence, every time we say yes to plans we don't really want just to avoid being alone, we're living in that palace. We're trying to arrange the external world to make our internal world feel safe. But Buddhism teaches us something revolutionary. The external world will never be arranged perfectly enough to give us lasting peace. People will come and go. Plans will fall through. phones will run out of battery. And when they do, what remains? This is the invitation of Siddhartha's journey. Not to abandon the world, but to stop depending on it for our sense of completeness. When we can sit alone without immediately reaching for distraction, when we can feel the silence without needing to fill it, when we can be with ourselves without judgment, that's when we begin to taste real freedom. So Siddhartha traded his silk robes for simple cloth, his golden ornaments for emptiness, his certain future for an uncertain path. He walked into the forest alone, carrying nothing but a question. How can we be free from suffering? For 6 years, he wandered from teacher to teacher, seeking answers he couldn't find in comfort. He tried extreme practices, fasting until his body was just skin and bones, sitting in painful positions for hours, denying himself even the most basic comforts. He thought that if pleasure couldn't bring peace, perhaps pain would, but this led to another crucial realization, one that speaks directly to how we handle loneliness today. Many of us swing between two extremes. Either we try to fill every moment with stimulation and connection, or we punish ourselves for feeling lonely, telling ourselves we should be stronger, more independent, less needy. Siddhartha discovered that both extremes lead to suffering. This insight became known as the middle way. Not the middle of two physical extremes, but the middle of two mental attitudes. It's the space between desperately seeking and harshly rejecting, between clinging and pushing away. Think about your own experience with solitude right now. Do you find yourself swinging between these extremes? Sometimes, desperately seeking connection, filling every moment with calls, texts, social media, and other times harshly judging yourself for feeling lonely, telling yourself you should be fine on your own. The middle way invites us to a completely different approach. It's the gentle recognition that loneliness, like all feelings, is temporary. It's neither something to frantically escape nor something to endure with gritted teeth. It's simply a visitor in the guest house of our awareness. And like all visitors, it will eventually leave. After 6 years of searching outside himself, Siddhartha finally did something radically simple. He sat down under a tree, not to achieve anything, not to become anything, but simply to be present with whatever arose. No teacher, no technique, no goal. Just a man sitting alone with his own experience. That night, under the tree, Siddhartha faced everything the mind throws at us when we stop running. Doubt arose. Who are you to think you can find enlightenment? Fear came. What if you're wasting your life? Desire whispered. You could go back to the palace, have a normal life, be safe. But instead of fighting these voices or believing them, he simply witnessed them. He touched the earth with his hand, a gesture that said, I am here, I am present, I am not going anywhere. And in that simple act of staying present with what is, rather than fleeing to what might be more comfortable, everything changed. When dawn broke, the man who had started the night as a seeker had become what we now call the Buddha, the awakened one. Not because he had gained something new, but because he had stopped running from what was already there. And here's what this means for you. right now, in this moment. Awakening isn't about getting somewhere else or becoming someone else. It's about fully arriving where you already are. And sometimes, often, that place is solitude. Not the solitude of isolation or rejection, but the solitude of presence. The sacred aloneness where you meet yourself without masks, without pretense, without the need to be anything other than exactly what you are. There's a moment that comes to all of us. Usually it arrives quietly, like a shadow falling across a sunny day. You're sitting alone, maybe after everyone has gone home, maybe in your car after a difficult conversation, and suddenly the weight of loneliness hits you like a physical thing. It sits on your chest. It makes your breathing shallow, and the mind starts its familiar refrain. Something is wrong with me. I shouldn't feel this way. Other people don't struggle like this. This is exactly what happened to a young monk in ancient China, though his story will change how you see that crushing feeling forever. It was winter when he arrived at the monastery, his face thin from traveling, his eyes tired from too many sleepless nights. He had studied Buddhist texts, practiced meditation, even lived with other monks for years. But there was something inside him that felt like a constant ache. A loneliness so deep that even surrounded by his spiritual brothers, he felt utterly alone. He found the old Zen master sweeping leaves in the courtyard. The wind kept scattering what the master had already gathered, but the old man continued sweeping without complaint, as if the leaves were always meant to fall again. The young monk waited until the master finished, then stepped forward and bowed deeply. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Master, I have studied the teachings. I have sat in meditation. I have tried to follow the path, but there is a feeling inside me that will not leave. Even when I'm surrounded by others, even during prayers and ceremonies, I feel completely alone. How do I get rid of this terrible loneliness?" Now here's where most people expect the master to offer comfort, to say something wise about connection or community. But Zen masters have a way of turning our expectations upside down. The old man looked at him with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of understanding. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he walked to a corner of the garden where stones of various shapes sat beside patches of moss. He picked up a smooth, palm-sized stone and handed it to the young monk. "Carry this," the master said softly, placing the stone into the young man's hands. "Keep it with you every day, in your robe, in your palm, wherever you go. Do not leave it behind no matter what happens. And when it no longer feels heavy, come back to me. Then we will speak again." The young monk frowned, confused. A stone? How could carrying a stone help with loneliness? But he didn't argue. He bowed once more and took the stone. Now, if you've ever felt the weight of emotional pain, you'll understand what happened next. At first, the stone was just annoying. It pressed into his side when he walked. It made his robe feel heavier than usual. It dragged slightly when he moved through his daily tasks. Sometimes he would forget about it, only to feel a small panic when he remembered and rushed to make sure it was still there. Other times, he would stare at it during meditation, wondering if he had misunderstood the instruction. Was this some kind of test, a punishment, a riddle he was supposed to solve? But here's what's brilliant about this teaching, and why it's perfect for anyone struggling with loneliness today. The master wasn't trying to solve the monk's problem. He was teaching him how to carry it differently. In Buddhist psychology, there's a concept called the second arrow. The first arrow is the actual experience: loneliness, sadness, fear. The second arrow is our resistance to that experience, our fighting against it, our judgment of it, our desperate attempts to make it go away. And here's the thing that will change your life. The second arrow causes more suffering than the first. Think about your own experience with loneliness. The feeling itself, that hollow ache in your chest, that's the first arrow. But then comes the second arrow. I hate feeling this way. I'm pathetic for being lonely. I should be stronger. Why can't I just be happy alone like other people seem to be? That resistance, that fight against the feeling, that's what makes loneliness unbearable. Days passed, and the young monk continued carrying the stone. Slowly, something began to shift. The weight that once felt like an intrusion became familiar. He stopped resenting it. It was simply there, part of his experience, neither good nor bad. He stopped thinking about it constantly. Some days, he almost forgot he was carrying it, though it never left his side. This is the exact same process that happens when we stop fighting our emotional experiences. When we stop trying to get rid of loneliness and instead learn to carry it with awareness, something miraculous begins to happen. The feeling doesn't necessarily disappear, but it loses its power over us. One morning, while fetching water from the well, the monk paused. The cold wind brushed his cheek. The sound of the bucket hitting water echoed in the still air. And he realized something extraordinary. The stone no longer felt heavy. Not because it had gotten lighter, but because he had learned how to carry it. He walked back to the temple and found the master raking soil in the garden. Without a word, the young monk placed the stone at the master's feet and bowed deeply. The master looked at him with gentle eyes and said, "Now tell me about your loneliness." The monk stood in silence for a long moment. He tried to speak, but somehow the words wouldn't come. Instead, he closed his eyes and searched for that aching feeling that had haunted him for so long. It was still there, faint, like the memory of a wound. But it no longer controlled him. It no longer defined his experience. He still spent time alone. He still walked without constant company. But the heaviness had dissolved. The master spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Loneliness is like the stone. At first it feels unbearable, too heavy to carry. But when you stop fighting it, when you carry it without resistance, it loses its weight. You see, what made it painful was not the aloneness itself, but your wish to escape it. The struggle was not with the feeling, but with your refusal to feel it. This teaching transforms everything about how we approach difficult emotions. In our culture, we're taught that feelings like loneliness are problems to be solved, conditions to be fixed, experiences to be avoided at all costs. But Buddhism offers a radically different approach. What if these feelings are not mistakes, but messengers? What if loneliness isn't a sign that something's wrong with you, but an invitation to develop a different kind of relationship with yourself? What if the feeling you're trying so hard to escape is actually trying to teach you something essential about being human? The Zen approach doesn't promise that you'll never feel lonely again. That would be like promising you'll never feel hungry or tired. Loneliness is part of the human experience. But what Zen does offer is infinitely more valuable. The ability to feel lonely without being consumed by loneliness. This is the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is inevitable. We will all experience loss, disappointment, isolation at times. But suffering is optional. Suffering is what happens when we resist our experience, when we fight against what is, when we tell ourselves that feeling lonely makes us broken or defective. So, here's what I want you to try. Right now, as you're listening to this, if you're feeling lonely, or if you feel lonely sometimes, instead of trying to push that feeling away, try something different. Place your hand on your heart. Feel the warmth of your palm against your chest, and say to yourself, gently, "This is loneliness. It's here right now. I don't have to like it, but I can carry it with kindness." Notice what happens when you stop fighting the feeling and simply acknowledge it. Does it feel as overwhelming? Does it have the same power over you when you're not trying to escape it? The young monk learned something that night that changed his entire relationship with solitude. Loneliness is not the absence of love. It's not a sign that you're unworthy of connection. It's simply one of many experiences that flow through human consciousness, like clouds moving across the sky. And when we learn to watch these clouds without needing to change the weather, we discover a peace that no external circumstance can disturb. In the seasons that followed, the monk stayed at the temple. He practiced with others, swept the same leaves that returned each morning, and sat for long hours in meditation. And when new students came to him with their own aches and questions, he would sometimes reach into his robe, pull out a small stone, and place it gently in their palm. "Carry this," he would say, with a gentle smile. "And when it no longer feels heavy, you will understand." There are some kinds of pain that break you so completely, you wonder if you'll ever be whole again. The kind of pain that makes you question everything you thought you knew about life, about fairness, about why terrible things happen to innocent people. If you've ever lost someone you loved more than your own life, you'll understand the story I'm about to tell you. And if you haven't experienced that kind of loss yet, this story will prepare you for one of life's most inevitable and devastating truths. Her name was Kisa Gotami, and she lived in a small village in ancient India. She was young, barely more than a girl herself, when she became a mother. The joy she felt holding her baby son for the first time was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Here was love in its purest form, unconditional, overwhelming, complete. For months, her world revolved around this tiny person. His first smile became her sunrise. His laughter filled every corner of their small home with light. She would watch him sleep and feel her heart might burst from the sheer intensity of her love. This child was not just her son. He was her purpose, her future, her reason for being. And then, on a day that started like any other, her world ended. The child fell ill suddenly. One moment he was playing, the next he was burning with fever. She tried everything: cooling cloths, healing herbs, desperate prayers to any god who might listen. But by evening, her son was gone. The silence that followed was not just the absence of sound. It was the absence of meaning itself. Kisa Gotami held her child's lifeless body and felt something inside her mind simply break. Not break open, but break apart. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be the end. When you're in that kind of shock, when reality becomes too terrible to accept, the mind sometimes creates its own reality. Kisa Gotami wrapped her son in cloth, pressed his small body close to her chest, and began walking from house to house. "Please," she begged at each door. "My baby is sick. Someone must have medicine. Someone must know how to help him." Her voice cracked like dry earth. Her eyes were wild with desperate hope. Her hair was disheveled from pulling at it in grief. The villagers tried to be gentle with her. They tried to explain that the child was gone. But Kisa Gotami couldn't hear them. She refused to understand. All she wanted was medicine. All she needed was someone to fix what had been broken. This went on for days. She wandered from village to village, barefoot, hungry, sleepless, carrying the weight of death as if it could still be reversed. Some people pitied her, others feared her, most simply closed their doors. But grief has a way of guiding us exactly where we need to go, even when we don't know we're being guided. Someone told her about a teacher named Buddha who was staying in a nearby grove. "Perhaps he can help," they said. And so, with the last threads of her hope gathered like ashes in her hands, she walked there. When she found the Buddha sitting quietly under a tree, she fell to her knees before him. Her words tumbled out in a desperate rush. "Please, Lord, my son is sick. I know there must be medicine somewhere. I've searched everywhere. I will do anything. Please, just tell me what to do." Now here's what's remarkable about the Buddha's response. He didn't tell her the child was dead. He didn't lecture her about acceptance or impermanence. He didn't try to force her to see reality before she was ready. Instead, he looked at her with eyes that held infinite compassion and said, "Yes, Kisa Gotami, there is something you can do. Bring me a handful of mustard seeds from a house that has never known death." Her heart leaped with hope. This sounded simple enough. In her village, Mustard seeds were common. Every household had them. She thanked the Buddha and left immediately, clutching her child closer to her chest. She knocked on the first door. A kind woman answered and nodded when Kisa asked for mustard seeds. "Of course," the woman said, happy to help. But then Kisa added, "Has anyone ever died in this house?" The woman's expression changed. "Yes," she said softly. "My father passed last year." Kisa shook her head and moved to the next house. At the second house, the same thing happened. Mustard seeds were available, but death had visited there too. A grandmother had died. The third house, a brother had been lost to illness. The fourth, a young mother in childbirth. The fifth, an infant, not unlike her own son. House after house, village after village, the story was the same. Mustard seeds were everywhere, but not one household had escaped death. And slowly, as the sun began to set, a different kind of understanding began to dawn in Kisa Gotami's heart. In Buddhist teaching, this is called learning through direct experience. The Buddha could have simply told her that death is universal, that everyone loses people they love. But intellectual understanding and heart understanding are two completely different things. She needed to discover this truth herself, in her own time, in her own way. By the time she knocked on the 20th door, something had shifted inside her. Her walk became slower. Her grip on her son's body became gentler. Her eyes, which had been frantic and wild, grew soft with a different kind of seeing. She was no longer searching for medicine. She was discovering the truth that every human being must eventually face. Death is not a mistake. It's not unfair. It's not a punishment. It's simply part of life. Not the opposite of life, but woven into it like threads in a tapestry. When she returned to the Buddha that evening, her arms were empty. She knelt before him again, but this time her voice was different, quieter, steadier. "I could not find a house untouched by death," she said. The Buddha simply nodded. "Now you understand," he said gently. And she did understand, not just with her mind, but with her entire being. Her grief was not unique. Her pain was not special. She was not being singled out by a cruel universe. She was simply experiencing what it means to be human, to love deeply and to lose what we love. This realization didn't make her grief disappear. Buddhism never promises that understanding will eliminate pain. But it did something far more profound. It connected her to every other human being who has ever loved and lost. Her sorrow became a bridge to universal compassion. From that day forward, Kisa Gotami remained close to the Buddha and his community. She learned to meditate, to sit with her grief without being consumed by it. When waves of sadness came, and they did come regularly, she learned to let them rise and fall like ocean tides. She discovered something that every person facing loss needs to know. Grief is not a problem to be solved. It's an experience to be lived through. And when we try to rush past it, when we try to get over it or move on, we often get stuck in the very pain we're trying to escape. But when we allow grief to be what it is, a natural response to love, a testament to the depth of our caring, something beautiful can happen. The pain doesn't disappear, but it transforms. It becomes softer, more spacious. It becomes a teacher rather than a tormentor. In time, Kisa Gotami became known not as the mad woman who wandered with her dead child, but as someone who had turned her deepest sorrow into wisdom. She would sit with other grieving mothers, not offering false comfort or empty platitudes, but simply being present with their pain. She knew that sometimes the most healing thing you can offer someone in grief is the simple acknowledgement. Yes, this is terrible. Yes, it hurts beyond words. And yes, you will survive this. Her story teaches us something essential about being alone with pain. There are some journeys we must walk by ourselves. Not because others don't care, not because we're being abandoned, but because certain kinds of understanding can only come through direct experience. No one could grieve for Kisa Gotami. No one could learn her lesson for her. She had to walk from house to house herself. She had to discover the universality of loss with her own heart. And in that walking, in that discovering, she found something more valuable than the medicine she was seeking. She found the strength to carry sorrow with grace. If you're carrying grief tonight, if you're walking through your own season of loss, remember Kisa Gotami's journey. You don't have to be grateful for your pain. You don't have to pretend it's a blessing. But you can trust that in walking with it consciously, in letting it teach you what it came to teach, you're participating in one of humanity's oldest and most sacred rites of passage. You're learning how to love deeply in a world where everything beloved will eventually be lost. And that learning, as painful as it is, makes you not harder, but more tender. Not more isolated, but more connected to the great web of human experience. The mustard seeds Kisa Gotami could never find were never really about finding medicine. They were about finding the medicine that was already within her. The capacity to transform suffering into wisdom, isolation into compassion, and the deepest loneliness into the most profound connection with all beings who have ever loved and lost. There's a question that haunts almost everyone at some point. What would happen if I had to be completely alone with myself for a long time? Not alone for a few hours, or even a few days, but truly alone. With no distractions, no entertainment, no one to talk to except the voice in your own head. Would you go crazy? Would you discover something terrible about yourself? Or would you find something you never knew was there? This is the story of a monk who answered that question in the most extreme way possible. His name was Yunmen, and what he discovered during 20 years of complete solitude will change how you think about being alone forever. Yunmen had been a monk for 15 years when he made a decision that shocked his entire monastery. He was well respected, well liked, considered wise and compassionate by his fellow monks. He had students who looked up to him, teachers who valued his insights, a comfortable place in the community. By all external measures, his spiritual life was successful. But something inside him felt unfinished. Not broken, not dissatisfied, but it was like having a song stuck in your head that you can't quite remember all the words to. He felt there was something deeper calling him, something that could only be discovered in complete solitude. So, one autumn morning, after morning prayers, he quietly packed a simple bag. One robe, one bowl, basic tools for survival. He told the abbot he needed to go on retreat, but he didn't say for how long. He walked into the mountains and found a small cave about halfway up a peak that few people ever climbed. The cave was just large enough for him to lie down and sit up comfortably. There was a small stream nearby for water, wild berries, and edible plants for basic nourishment. Most importantly, there were no other human beings for miles in any direction. Just him, the mountain, and silence so complete it had its own presence. The first few weeks were harder than he expected, not because of the physical conditions he had lived simply before, but because of the mental conditions. When you remove all external stimulation, your mind becomes incredibly loud. Every unresolved conversation he'd ever had played on repeat. Every doubt he'd ever pushed aside came rushing back. Every emotion he'd been too busy to feel suddenly demanded attention. He would wake up in the morning and his mind would immediately start generating lists. Things he should be doing, people he should be helping, problems that needed solving. But there were no people to help, no problems to solve, no things to do except sit, breathe, and be. The mind, so used to having external projects to focus on, began to turn in on itself. This is what Buddhist psychology calls withdrawal symptoms from stimulation. In our modern world, we're addicted to constant input. Phones, conversations, music, television, even our own thoughts become a form of entertainment. When all of that is suddenly removed, the mind goes through a kind of detox. Yunmen described the first month as sitting with 1,000 monkeys. His thoughts jumped from branch to branch, never settling, always agitated. He would try to meditate and find himself planning conversations with people who were hundreds of miles away. He would try to be present and find himself reliving embarrassing moments from decades past. But he stayed, not because he was enjoying it, but because something told him this was necessary. Like a fever that has to run its course, his mind needed to exhaust itself before something deeper could emerge. Around the third month, something began to shift. The mental chatter didn't disappear, but it began to lose its urgency. He started to notice that thoughts were just thoughts. They arose, they demanded attention, but if he didn't feed them with more thinking, they naturally faded away. It was like discovering that the voice in his head was not actually him. It was just one aspect of his experience, like the sound of wind through trees or water flowing over rocks. Interesting, sometimes pleasant, sometimes annoying, but not something that defined who he was. By the 6th month, Yunmen had made a remarkable discovery. He wasn't lonely. Not because he had transcended the need for human connection, but because he had found a different kind of companionship. The mountain itself became his friend. The changing seasons became his entertainment. The rhythm of his own breathing became his music. In Zen, there's a teaching that says, before you study Zen, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. While you study Zen, mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers. After you study Zen, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. Yunmen was beginning to understand what this meant. At first, nature had just been background to his human dramas. Then, as his mind quieted, he began to see nature as separate from himself, something to be observed and appreciated. But eventually, the boundary between observer and observed began to dissolve. He wasn't watching the mountain. He was participating in the same existence as the mountain. This might sound mystical or abstract, but it has practical implications for anyone struggling with loneliness. When we feel isolated, it's usually because we're trapped in the story of being a separate self who needs other separate selves to feel complete. But solitude can teach us that this separateness is partly an illusion. Years passed. Yunmen developed routines that had nothing to do with human society, but everything to do with being alive. He would wake with the sun, not because he had to, but because his body naturally synchronized with the light. He would gather food when he was hungry, rest when he was tired, sit in meditation, not as a practice, but as a natural expression of contentment. He began to understand what the ancient Taoists meant when they talked about Wu Wei, effortless action. When you're not constantly reacting to other people's expectations and needs, your own natural rhythm emerges. You discover what you actually want to do, how you actually want to live, who you actually are, beneath all the social conditioning. One day, in his 15th year of solitude, a young monk from his old monastery climbed the mountain to find him. The monastery had sent periodic search parties over the years, but Yunmen had always avoided them. This time, for some reason, he let himself be found. The young monk was shocked by what he saw. He had expected to find either a madman or a corpse. Instead, he found someone who radiated a kind of peace he had never encountered. Yunmen's eyes were clear, his smile genuine, his presence so grounded that the young monk immediately felt calmer just being near him. "Master," the young monk said, "I have been sent to check on your welfare. How have you survived up here alone for so long? Haven't you been lonely? Haven't you missed human company?" Yunmen looked at the young man with gentle amusement. "Lonely," he repeated. "How can I be lonely when I am never alone? The wind keeps me company. The seasons visit me regularly. The stars tell me stories every night. And most importantly," he paused, placing a hand over his heart, "I have finally become friends with myself." The young monk didn't understand immediately, But something in Yunmen's words planted a seed. Here was someone who had discovered that the companionship we're all seeking doesn't have to come from other people. It can come from being truly present with our own existence, truly intimate with our own experience. But don't you miss conversation? The young monk pressed. Don't you miss sharing your thoughts and insights with others? Yunmen smiled. I have had the most fascinating conversations of my life up here. Conversations with silence, with solitude, with the deepest parts of myself that I never had time to meet when I was busy talking to everyone else. I have learned things that can only be learned alone. After the young monk left, Yunmen continued his mountain retreat for 5 more years. But something had shifted. The visit had reminded him that his insights weren't meant to be hoarded. Eventually, he made his way back down the mountain, not because he was tired of solitude, but because he was ready to share what solitude had taught him. He spent his remaining years teaching, but his teaching was different from before. He spoke with the authority of someone who had met himself completely, who had faced every fear, processed every emotion, and come out the other side whole. Students would travel for months just to sit in his presence, because he embodied something they all secretly longed for: the ability to be completely comfortable in their own skin. Yunmen's 20 years of solitude teach us something revolutionary about loneliness. It's not a problem to be solved, but a doorway to be walked through. On the other side of that doorway is not just the ability to be alone, but the ability to be truly present with others. Because when you're no longer running from yourself, you can finally show up fully for life itself. Have you ever noticed how the most beautiful sounds come from emptiness? The hollow of a flute creates music. The empty space inside a bell allows it to ring. The vacant room echoes with possibilities. Yet we spend our entire lives trying to fill every empty space, terrified that emptiness means something is missing. There was once a tea master in ancient Japan who understood something about emptiness that changed everything for those who met him. His name was Rikyu, and he lived during a time when the tea ceremony had become an elaborate display of wealth and status. Rich merchants would compete to own the most expensive tea bowls, the rarest utensils, the most ornate decorations. Tea had become about having, not about being. But Rikyu saw something different in the simple act of sharing tea. Something that had nothing to do with possessions and everything to do with presence. He began to strip away the unnecessary, the ornamental, the impressive. His tea room was deliberately small, deliberately simple. No decorations, except perhaps a single flower. No elaborate utensils, just the essential tools needed for the ceremony. One day, a wealthy merchant came to study with Rikyu. This man owned everything: houses, servants, countless treasures. But he felt empty inside, hollow, like something essential was missing from his life. He had heard that Rikyu could teach him the secret of contentment through tea. The merchant arrived carrying an expensive silk bag filled with his most prized tea implements. Golden utensils, jade containers, a tea bowl that had cost him more than most people earned in a year. He was ready to impress the master with his collection. Rikyū welcomed him into the tiny tea room and gestured for him to sit. The merchant began unpacking his treasures, arranging them carefully for display. But Rikyū gently shook his head. "Today," the master said quietly, "we will use only this." He held up a simple clay cup, rough around the edges, with a small chip on one side. The merchant frowned. "But master, I have brought the finest bowl money can buy. This cup is broken." "Yes," Rikyū smiled. "It is perfectly imperfect, and because it is empty, it can hold something beautiful." This is where the teaching begins, and it's directly relevant to anyone who's ever felt like their life is lacking something. In our culture, we're constantly told that emptiness is the enemy. Empty bank accounts, empty calendars, empty relationships, empty achievements lists. These are seen as failures, problems to be solved immediately. But Zen Buddhism teaches something revolutionary. Emptiness is not the absence of value. It's the presence of infinite possibility. A cup that's already full cannot receive anything new. A mind that's already cluttered with possessions, achievements, and identities has no room for wonder. Rikyū began the tea ceremony with deliberate slowness. Every movement was intentional, every gesture mindful. He heated the water not as a task to be completed, but as a meditation to be experienced. He measured the tea, not with hurried efficiency, but with reverent attention. The merchant watched, growing increasingly impatient. "When do we get to the important part?" he asked. "This is the important part," Rikyū replied gently. "Every moment of this ceremony is the important part. The water becoming warm, the steam rising, the silence between us, the simple act of sitting together." As the ceremony continued, something began to happen to the merchant. At first, he kept glancing at his expensive implements, feeling frustrated that they weren't being used. But gradually, his attention began to settle into the present moment. He noticed the sound of the water bubbling, the way the steam curled upward like incense, the feeling of sitting still without needing to accomplish anything. When Rikyū finally poured the tea into the simple clay cup, the merchant received it with different eyes. The tea tasted unlike any he had ever drunk, not because it was a rare variety, but because he was fully present to taste it. The rough texture of the cup against his lips felt grounding, real, honest. "I don't understand," the merchant said, his voice softer now. "I have tasted tea from the finest porcelain, yet this simple cup makes the tea taste more." Rikyū nodded knowingly. The cup is empty of pretense, so it can be full of presence. Your expensive bowl is already full of history, full of cost, full of the need to be impressive. This simple cup asks for nothing except to serve this moment. This teaching revolutionizes how we understand fulfillment. In Buddhist philosophy, there's a concept called beginner's mind. approaching each experience with the freshness of someone encountering it for the first time. But you can only have beginner's mind when you're empty of preconceptions, empty of the need to prove anything, empty of the constant mental commentary that says, "I already know this." Think about your own life for a moment. How much of your unhappiness comes from feeling empty? Empty of achievements, empty of relationships, empty of purpose? But what if that emptiness isn't a problem to be solved? What if it's space waiting to be filled with awareness, with presence, with appreciation for what's actually here? As the tea ceremony drew to a close, the merchant sat in silence. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his next acquisition, his next achievement, his next goal. He was simply here, in this moment, feeling completely full despite having nothing to show for the last hour except an empty cup. "Master," he said finally, "I came here to learn about tea, but I think you've taught me about life. I've spent so much energy filling my days with activities, my house with objects, my mind with plans. But I've never just been empty. I've never given myself permission to have nothing to do, nowhere to go, nothing to prove." Rikyū smiled and carefully cleaned the simple clay cup. "The heart is like this cup," he said. "When it's empty of demands and expectations, it can be filled with wonder. When it's empty of the need to be elsewhere, it can be fully here. When it's empty of the story of what your life should look like, it can appreciate what your life actually is." This is one of the most profound teachings in all of Buddhism. The difference between emptiness and fullness is not what you think. We imagine that fullness comes from accumulation, more experiences, more relationships, more achievements. But true fullness comes from appreciation. And appreciation can only happen when we're empty enough to actually receive what's being offered in this moment. From that day forward, the merchant began to practice what he learned in that tea room. Instead of filling every silence with noise, he would sit quietly and listen. Instead of cramming his schedule with appointments, he would leave space for spontaneity. Instead of measuring his worth by what he owned, he began to find richness in simply being alive. He discovered that loneliness isn't really about being alone. It's about being disconnected from the present moment. When you're fully here, fully present, fully empty of the need for life to be different than it is, you realize you're never actually alone. You're in intimate relationship with existence itself. The empty cup teaches us that sometimes the most radical thing we can do is stop trying to fill our lives and start appreciating the space. The silence between words, the pause between breaths, the stillness between thoughts. That's where peace lives. That's where contentment waits. Not in having more, but in needing less. Not in being full, but in being empty enough to be filled with what's actually here. And what's actually here, in this moment, is always enough. There's a moment that comes to everyone who sits quietly with themselves long enough. A moment when all the mental chatter suddenly stops, and you catch a glimpse of something you've never seen before. Not something new, but something that was always there, hidden beneath the constant noise of thinking, planning, worrying, and becoming. This is the moment when you meet your true face. In the mountains of ancient Tibet, there lived a monk named Milarepa, who spent his days in solitary meditation. Unlike many spiritual seekers, he wasn't looking for visions or supernatural powers. He was searching for something much more elusive, the answer to the question, "Who am I really?" Every morning, Milarepa would walk to a crystal-clear lake high in the mountains. The water was so still and pure that it acted like a perfect mirror, reflecting the sky, the clouds, and anyone who looked into it with absolute clarity. This became his daily practice, not just meditation, but literally looking at his own reflection in nature's most honest mirror. For months, when Milarepa looked into the lake, he saw exactly what you'd expect. A face with features he recognized: eyes, nose, mouth, the expression of someone trying very hard to be spiritual. He saw the person he thought he was, the monk, the seeker, the one working toward enlightenment. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, something began to change. Not in the lake. The lake remained perfectly still. The change was in how he looked. Instead of glancing quickly and then getting on with his meditation, he began to really look. To look without judgment, without trying to improve what he saw, without wishing he looked different or more enlightened. One morning, as he knelt by the water's edge in the pre-dawn darkness, something extraordinary happened. As the first light of sunrise hit the lake, he looked down, and for just an instant, he didn't see his reflection. He saw something that made him gasp out loud. He saw the sky. Not the reflection of the sky in the water, but the actual sky looking back at him from where his face should have been. For a split second, the boundary between the one looking and what was being looked at completely disappeared. There was no Milarepa looking at water. There was just looking itself, pure awareness encountering itself. The moment passed quickly, but it left him shaken to his core. What he had glimpsed wasn't a mystical vision or a supernatural experience. It was the most natural thing in the world, the recognition that what he truly was had no fixed form, no solid boundaries, no permanent identity. This experience points to one of the deepest teachings in Buddhist philosophy, the doctrine of no self, or anatman. But this isn't a philosophical concept you study in books. It's a direct recognition that happens when the mind becomes still enough to see beyond its own projections. Think about your own experience of looking in mirrors. Usually, when you see your reflection, you immediately start a mental commentary. I look tired. My hair's a mess. I'm getting older. I need to lose weight. Or maybe, I look good today. That's a nice shirt. My skin's looking better. But what Milarepa discovered was something completely different. When you look without the mental commentary, when you see without the constant evaluation and judgment, you begin to recognize that the self you think you're looking at is largely a mental construction. It's a story the mind tells about this collection of sensations, thoughts, and experiences. From that day forward, Milarepa's meditation practice changed completely. Instead of trying to become someone better or more enlightened, he began practicing what Zen calls just sitting. Not sitting to achieve anything, not sitting to get anywhere, but sitting to recognize what was already true, that the awareness looking through his eyes was the same awareness looking through every pair of eyes that had ever existed. This recognition transforms loneliness completely. When you realize that your deepest identity isn't the personality with its history and preferences and fears, but the pure awareness in which all experiences arise, you understand that you share this awareness with every living being. You're not alone because there's no separate you to be alone. But this isn't a cold or detached realization. It's the most intimate discovery possible. Milarepa described it as falling in love with existence itself. When you're no longer imprisoned by the narrow boundaries of personal identity, when you recognize your true nature as limitless awareness, everything becomes incredibly precious and beautiful. The loneliness we feel is often the loneliness of the ego, the constructed self that feels separate from everything else. But beyond the ego is something that was never born and will never die, something that is always connected to everything because it is the very fabric of connection itself. Milarepa spent years by that lake, learning to see with what he called the eyes of the sky. Not the personal eyes that judge and compare and separate, but the impersonal awareness that simply sees what is, without adding anything to it or taking anything away. Sometimes tourists would climb the mountain and find him sitting motionless by the water. They would ask him what he was doing, and he would simply say, "Learning to disappear." What he meant wasn't that he was trying to cease existing, but that he was learning to let go of the false self that feels separate and isolated. He was discovering that when you stop defending and maintaining an artificial identity, what remains is infinitely more vast and connected than what you lost. The mirror lake became famous throughout Tibet, not because it had magical properties, but because spending time there could show you the most important truth of all. What you're looking for is what's looking. The peace you seek is the awareness that's seeking. The love you want is the consciousness that wants it. In our modern world, we rarely take time to look this deeply. We're constantly distracted by screens that show us everything except ourselves, by noise that drowns out the subtle voice of awareness, by busyness that keeps us from sitting still long enough to see what's always been here. But you don't need to climb a mountain in Tibet to find your mirror lake. Any moment of genuine stillness can become that perfect reflection. Any time you stop running from yourself and simply sit quietly, you create the possibility for the same recognition that transformed Milarepa's life. The next time you feel lonely, try this. Instead of trying to fill the emptiness or escape from it, sit quietly and ask yourself, who is it that feels lonely? Look for the one who is experiencing the loneliness. See if you can find the boundaries of this self that feels separate. What you might discover, if you look deeply enough, is that the one who feels lonely is just another experience arising in awareness. And the awareness itself. Vast, open, unchanging. That awareness is never lonely because it is the very space in which all experiences of connection and separation arise. This is the ultimate teaching of the mirror lake. You are not the reflection. You are the mirror itself. Perfectly clear, always present, reflecting everything with complete acceptance, but never stained or damaged by what appears within it. And a mirror, no matter how alone it might appear to be, is never truly isolated. It is always in perfect relationship with whatever light finds it, always ready to show the truth of what is, always serving the deepest function of consciousness itself. To know, to see, to be aware. When you recognize yourself as this mirror-like awareness, loneliness doesn't disappear. It's simply seen for what it really is. Another beautiful, temporary reflection in the infinite sky of your true nature. As we reach the end of these ancient stories, I want you to take a moment and notice something. Right now, in this very instant, you're not actually alone. You're in the presence of your own awareness, your own breath, your own aliveness. And that presence has been with you through every story we've shared tonight. The prince who left his palace, the student who carried the stone, the mother who transformed her grief, the monk who found companionship in solitude, the tea master who discovered fullness in emptiness, and the meditator who saw his true face in the mirror lake. They all discovered the same secret you're touching right now. Peace doesn't come from having the perfect life. It comes from being fully present with the life you have. Happiness doesn't come from never being alone. It comes from learning to be at home with yourself. And freedom doesn't come from controlling your circumstances. It comes from changing your relationship to whatever circumstances arise. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you have a choice. You can continue to see solitude as something to escape from, or you can begin to see it as something to explore. You can keep believing that being alone means something is wrong, or you can start discovering what's been right all along. Your journey into the wisdom of solitude doesn't require dramatic changes. It begins with small moments of presence. Tomorrow morning, before reaching for your phone, try sitting quietly for just 5 minutes. Feel your breath. Notice the silence. Let yourself simply be. When loneliness visits, and it will visit, remember the stone that taught acceptance. Carry the feeling without fighting it. When grief comes, remember Kisa Gautami walking from house to house, discovering that suffering is the thread that connects all human hearts. Remember that every great spiritual teacher in history found their deepest insights not in crowds, but in silence, not in noise, but in stillness, not in running from themselves, but in turning toward the vast, open space of their own being. As you drift into sleep tonight, let yourself rest in this truth. You are never truly alone because you are never truly separate from the awareness that is looking through your eyes right now. That awareness is your deepest companion, your most faithful friend, your eternal home. And in that recognition, may you find the peace that has been waiting for you all along. Not in the future, not in different circumstances, but here, now, in the sacred solitude of simply being alive. Sweet dreams. Your journey into true freedom begins tonight.